Welcome to Everything Money, a very special episode we bring you today. I'm here with Paul and Mo. On today's show, we have the author of Richer, Wiser, Happier, William Green. We've been a fan of this book and now this author for many, many months as it came out earlier this year. Paul, for me, this book really brought in a true writer's analogy of how to be a value investor. He interviewed some of the most famous investors in the world, and we're delighted to have him on the show. I welcome in William Green. William, thanks for joining us today. How are you, my friend?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm a new fan of the show, having watched a few episodes over recent days. I'm like, these guys actually know what they're talking about. So I'm a little bit nervous now.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah, Paul will offend you in the coming episodes, so you'll be fine. Okay. I was telling my wife, William, and not to bring too much about me, but like, I went down this journey of listening to my confidant Paul tell me about what a value investing is, what a value investor is. And it seemed like this weird, antiquated old man style of investing. And sure enough, I had my doubts. And then up until earlier this year, I when this book and the way you describe the concept and the mindsets of investing, it just really was an epiphany to me about how it is the one concept that actually works. You've proven it by investing by interviewing some of the best investors all over the world. And I told my wife it took a scholar like yourself and an author to really put it in these wonderful words about what value investing is. So I welcome you in. That's my take, Paul. And I'd like to start. Can you tell, you've written for magazines for the past 20, 30 years, Forbes and Times. Give our viewers who have your book, we've been pushing it for 7 months now, give your viewers a little insight as to who you are and your journey to get to this stage in life.
Sure. I lived by the pen as a writer and editor for the best part of 30 years, actually longer than 30 years. It's kind of frightening. I'm 53 now, and I started when I was about 20, 21, writing for magazines.
Wow.
So I started off writing for things like The Spectator in England, which was this old kind of very literary magazine that people like Samuel Johnson had written for. I mean, it was a classic magazine. And I would write book reviews. And then I came to America and I started to write these long narrative features about things like Byron DeLay Beckwith, the guy who killed Medgar Evers in the 60s and was being retried, And so I thought I was going to be kind of this great literary figure, and I was writing about books and stories. And so I had these kind of very highfalutin, slightly pompous ambitions to be kind of a great writer. I was sort of like, if I'm not Proust or Flaubert, at least I'll be like someone great like Calvin Trillin, one of the great New Yorker writers. And then in my mid-20s, part of what happened is my brother and I had owned an apartment together in London before property in London became kind of an amazing, amazing thing to own. And we sold it because my brother was upgrading to move into a much grander apartment, and I was living in America at the time. And so suddenly I had this small windfall, and I had to figure out, what the hell am I going to do with the money? And so I start to study investing, and I'd always been a bit of a gambler. When I was about 15, I went to this school, Eton, which was where people like Prince William and Prince Harry and two of the last three British prime ministers, David Cameron and Boris Johnson, had gone. So they were all these kind of flash fancy people, and I was going off on like these long, lazy summer afternoons to what was euphemistically called a turf accountant in England, which is basically just a fancy term for a betting shop. And I and this friend of mine, who later ended up going to prison, but who was a very brilliant guy, would go together and gamble on horses. And so I always loved the idea that you could kind of make money without doing any hard work. And that was sort of my childish fantasy when I was gambling on horses. And then I realized that wasn't going to happen. I gave up gambling on horses. But then in my mid-20s, when I discovered the stock market and I start reading about stocks and funds, I'm like, this is spectacular. I can get rich without actually doing any hard work. And so it kind of set off this new fantasy where I was like, this is actually the real game. But the thing that was unlikely and incredibly fortunate about my career is that because I got to write for things like Forbes and Fortune and Money and Time and things like that, I actually could go interview all of these legendary investors.
Yeah.
So I have become obsessed with someone like Marty Whitman, who most people have forgotten now, who is this curmudgeonly, very old, very brilliant dean of value investing. He was one of the giants of value investing, who would talk about how stupid most other investors were and how his approach made sense. Yeah, exactly. And I would invest a tiny amount. I mean, I think when I first invested, I put $3,000 or something in his fund. But I would then go interview him and write about him for Forbes. And then, for example, right after 9/11, literally maybe 9 days after 9/11, I traveled for a couple of days with Bill Miller, who was probably the greatest mutual fund manager of his generation.
Wow.
So while the market was falling apart and it was having the worst crash basically since 1929, I'm literally sitting in a room with Bill Miller, the great contrarian value investor, as he's betting hundreds of millions of dollars on stocks that are melting down. So I go from being this kind of smart alecky kid who just wanted to make money without working hard, actually to being in the room with the great investors as they're doing what they do. And so what gradually happened is I started to realize these guys are really interesting. They're not just really smart, but they're kind of these weird mutant characters who see the world differently than everyone else. And they're cleverer and they're more rational. And so in some strange way, I became obsessed with them as characters as well, both with their insights and as characters. And so in a way, if you go back to my original fantasy of being kind of a literary storyteller and great narrative writer, suddenly I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Actually, I can write stories about these really interesting money men who are dealing with the most fundamental problems in life, like the fact that we have no idea what the future holds, and yet we got to make decisions about the future. How do you do that? And because they have skin in the game, they're not like journalists like me or like academics who have tenure who can just be wrong and there's no real price.
Right.
If you're Bill Miller, if you were wrong in those days after the Twin Towers were blown up, you would lose billions and billions of dollars. And so to go back to Dr. Johnson, who we mentioned earlier, who wrote for The Spectator, he said that the prospect of hanging concentrates the mind admirably. And I think the prospect of losing money concentrates the mind admirably. And so these guys, they actually had to think well because there was so much skin in the game. And so I think in some weird roundabout way, I ended up discovering this kind of subculture of very brilliant investors who had to think well. And so they become a kind of filter to see everything about the world. They teach you how to think about uncertainty and the fact that the future is unknowable, and yet we have to make decisions. But they also teach you, how to achieve financial independence and financial security. But then they also teach you what the money actually even means. Like, why are you spending all your time chasing after money? Is it going to make you happy? What does it contribute to your happiness, and what doesn't it contribute? So for me, they became this filter to sort of look at everything in life. And so that's the madly ambitious goal of Richer, Wiser, Happier, is kind of to distill what I figured out over the last 25 years from these extraordinary people.
Yeah, William, it's funny you say that about the people you interviewed. Our show was based on me asking questions to Paul. And the more I read about the investors in the book, I was just telling Paul that they all sounded like him. They sounded like you sort of said, curmudgeonly old guys who like stick to trends. They're somewhat solo in their.
Not somewhat solo. They are solo.
Yeah, there's like solo. Yeah. Like Paul likes tennis and chess. Like he likes curling up with his dogs and staying home on a Friday night. And not that it's a bad thing, but like he likes reading everything of the guys in the book. Like, is this what you learned about these folks? And I was struggling reading the book, like as Paul struggles in real life about the idea of finding happiness with like making money and how it translates into happiness. Did you find this with the guys in the book? Like, describe that.
Yeah, well, you get a couple of really important ideas, and my mind is kind of exploding because I don't quite know in which direction to go. So I'll do with the first thing you mentioned, which is this idea that there are these very independent thinkers and who are going solo, and that's a really important insight, actually. that if you think about it, to beat the market, you have to diverge from the market.
Of course.
Right?
Yes.
And so I think there's a certain logic to the idea that it's going to, the greatest investors are going to be slightly mutant characters, right? They're going to be people who are happy to go off in their own direction, who think for themselves. And there's a chapter that I write called The Willingness to be Lonely, which is about these people who have this ability to think for themselves, to question orthodox opinion. And one of the things that brought it through for me was many years ago, when I was a young journalist. I say young, I was 30, I think. I went to, it seems young now, I went to the Bahamas to spend a day with Sir John Templeton, who was probably the greatest international stock picker of the 20th century. And there was a time where I was on the beach and he didn't know that I was there. And I was kind of hiding behind a palm tree and watching him as he exercised in the water. And here's this guy, I've kind of come to see this sage, right? This kind of Yoda figure who's going to tell me how to live and how to think. He was 86 years old at the time. And he's wearing this ridiculous floppy hat with a visor and ear flaps. And he's got like sun cream just slathered all over his face, like big white dollops of cream all over his face. And he's pumping his arms like this in the ocean and his legs under the water. And so I look at this and I'm sort of thinking, this is kind of comic, right? I mean, here's this guy who looks sort of ridiculous. And what I came to realize is that willingness to look ridiculous and to do it his own way was absolutely essential to his success. He was a guy who questioned everything. And so, I mean, he did this amazing thing during World War II, where the world seemed like it was about to fall apart. I mean, it was total catastrophe, right? And I think, if I remember rightly, the Nazis had just invaded France and the stock market was just plummeting. I mean, you'd be shocked if you knew the levels that the Dow was at then. I mean, I think it fell to like 200 or 120. I mean, like ridiculous levels. It was like this catastrophic time, and it seemed like the world was ending. And Templeton, who was this young, inexperienced investor, looks at the Wall Street Journal and picks out 104 stocks that were all selling for less than $1 a share. And he calls this broker and he says, I want to buy all of these companies. And the guy says to him, well, yeah, but 37 of them are in bankruptcy, so we didn't buy them for you. And he said, no, I want to buy those too. Those are likely to outperform even more. Right. And he had this realization that what he called the point of maximum pessimism, the moment where everybody thought the world was coming to an end and nobody wanted to own a stock, that was exactly the time that you could get an incredible bargain. And so he had the courage as this young guy to go totally against the crowd. And he told me that basically within, I think, 5 years, he had quintupled his money. Wow. And so that was an extraordinary thing. So in some ways, if you look at this guy marching in the water, which he did for 45 minutes every day, that was the way he exercised, right? He's just thinking, well, here's a beautiful spot. I'm in the warm, crystal clear water in the Bahamas. I'm exercising for free. It's healthy. I don't care if people think I'm wearing a stupid hat with stupid ear flaps. I don't care if they think I'm weird for marching in the water. I figured out a really effective whole body exercise for free in the sun. So if you want to judge me, right, good luck to you, mate. And he did the same thing during World War II with that bet. He did the same thing. One of the things that he did, he decided that he was going to leave his fortune. I mean, he was investigating these things like, does prayer work? How do you pray? If you put your hands on someone, are you more likely to be able to heal them than if they pray for themselves? Should you be saying "Thy will be done," or is there some other way of praying? And he would bankroll research at Harvard Medical School into whether prayer worked, because he was trying to marry science and faith. And so there was something also just tremendously free-spirited about his intellect there. And So if you think about that, whatever your views about spirituality or science or whether they go together or not, that ability to question orthodoxy and go your own way is absolutely central. And so if there's a takeaway for regular people, like I hesitate to say regular people like us, since you all look pretty eccentric and I'm pretty eccentric too. If there's a takeaway for relatively normal people, it's to ask, well, how am I wired? What are my talents? Am I somebody who needs to be part of the crowd, who likes to be part of the crowd? Or am I someone psychologically who's able to diverge from the crowd? And there's no judgment in that. It's not, I mean, on the whole, it's better probably in life to be part of the crowd. I just happen not to be wired that way. I'm a writer. We're outsiders. And so maybe that's one reason why I found these people very sympathetic, these great investors, because I'm a kind of weird non-tribal person. And they're weird non-tribal, free-thinking mavericks as well. So I think you have to know yourself, and you have to say, am I somebody who, when everything is surging, when the stock market's surging, or when cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Solana and Ethereum are surging, do I feel like this incredible lure to join the herd, join the stampeding herd? Or am I somebody who's able to stand apart from the herd and say, let me see, does this make sense? Is this a bubble? Is there excessive optimism here? Do I really understand these things? And Templeton, I think, used to say, that the most dangerous words in investing were "this time is different." Mm-hmm. You need always to say, well, yeah, there have been a lot of fads in the past. There have been there are a lot of times where people get carried away. So let me if everyone else is getting carried away, let me be a little more careful. And likewise, when everyone else is panicked, like they were in World War II or like they were at the start of COVID, just say, well, is the world really ending? And as Howard Marks, one of the great investors, said to me, the guy who manages about $140, $150 billion, he said, most of the time, the world doesn't end. And so in these moments of maximum pessimism, there's tremendous opportunity. And in the moments of maximum optimism, there's reason to be fearful. And so the ability to step back from the crowd and just be a little rational and think for yourself becomes a kind of mental superpower, I would say.